Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to have you all here. This is a webinar of the Hoover Working Group on China's digital currency and electronic payment system. This is one of an occasional series of webinars that the working group is going to hold to inform itself on its research about China's new central bank digital currency. Today, we're really fortunate to have our webinar led by Professor Robert Townsend, who is the Elizabeth and James Killian Professor of Economics at MIT. Rob is renowned for his work in many areas of macroeconomics, theory, microfinance, development. But today he's going to be focusing on his insights into digital payments. I imagine he might be drawing ideas from his new book, which is titled Distributed Ledgers, Design and Regulation of Financial Infrastructure and Payment Systems. And Rob can introduce his topic. We are going to take questions in the Q&A, and I will feed those to Rob occasionally. This is a 40-minute, we have until 40 minutes past the hour. And then if those members of the working group that are present would simply stay on, we'll have a short working group meeting immediately after the webinar is finished. So Rob, let me turn it over to you, and thank you very much for doing this.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, to have this opportunity to present. So this is about optimized payment and financial infrastructure with special reference to DCEP, which is China's version. This slide is to get the background and context into the conversation very quickly. I'm going to focus on digital currency within countries and also the role across countries. So the basic take on the current version of China's DCEP is that commercial banks will exchange reserves for these e-tokens, which will serve as legal tender. There will be privacy on identity for transactions, but the transactions themselves will be public. The People's Bank of China is likely to see most, if not all, of what's going on. There has been a decision made evidently to not focus on programmable money and not to use the quote unquote distributed ledgers if that comes with validation protocols. I want to emphasize these are China's current choices. Other countries could make potentially different choices, and China may in fact, change its own system potentially. So across countries, I want to focus on SWIFT, which is the predominant current legacy infrastructure using correspondent banks to transfer liquidity across countries intraday. It has to solve the problem of obtaining liquidity by matching and balancing flows, and likewise any alternative to such legacy infrastructure will need to address these problems of having liquidity and deep markets. It's really quite an open question and of great interest how to handle the cross-border payments problem. It's universally recognized under G20 and BIS, IMF plans to come up with blueprints for new designs. So choices and how to make them. What is woven into this talk is the idea that we need to understand the individual pieces and component parts of these actual and potential systems. We need to start with the economic objectives, what we're trying to accomplish, and not let the new technology per se have us looking for applications to use it. Context is going to matter a lot, and then we can assemble the most effective designs. So let me say just a little bit more about the component parts, the individual pieces. I think it's really important to make these distinctions because it often becomes pretty cloudy without making the distinctions. So I'm going to talk about ledgers, e-value transfers, and cryptography. So ledgers, as in a database of transactions. Here I would recommend some work in data science, which makes very useful distinctions and proves theorems about the advantages and disadvantages of centralized systems, which are, with a smile, referred to as CRUD, create, read, update, and delete, delegated to individual parties. Decentralized systems, there are choices about how synchronous or asynchronous they should be. I guess something we're used to from teaching now. And there are theorems about CAP, consistency, access, and partition tolerance. I want to emphasize that this way of thinking about a database applies not only to digital currency ledgers, but also to traditional existing data sources. The second component is money and e-value transfers. Typically, one will see multiple monies coexisting in a given country, including private issues. There are extremes. For example, in the Thai context, it's largely, and in some areas, virtually exclusively paper currency. In Sweden, it's now almost the other way around, a virtual e-world with very little paper currency left. Most countries are in between. Kenya, I often think of in my mind as a very revealing prototype with a privately issued e-money on a cell phone provider. M-Pesa is the name of the money. It coexists with Kenyan shillings, and this is both the reality and a useful metaphor. Third component is cryptography. In particular, can't help but mention Bitcoin. As a distributed ledger for payments, it uses messages with signatures, hashes, Merkle trees for the database part, and cryptographic puzzles. So it's a rather interesting and certainly complicated entity bringing in all these different aspects. I want to mention specifically encryption, fully homomorphic encryption, and multi-party computation, and something related, which is trusted execution environments. So they'll play a role as they pop up on the slides. So optimized design. The goal, to me, is to achieve Pareto optimal allocations. That is to say, allocations such that no one can be made better off without making someone else worse off. How do we find and think about these optimized design? We solve constrained optimization problems, maximizing weighted payoffs or utilities of the participants subject to resource constraints, transactions costs, information constraints, and so on. Under the latter, under information, the constraints would involve incentives to tell the truth about unobserved states, or to deal with moral hazard for unobserved actions, and to deal with ex-ante adverse selection considerations. So this same criterion, the Pareto criterion, is not just for private systems. It can be used to think about public policy and used to think about regulation. And typically we're going to see the need for some public-private partnerships, and that includes not thwarting, but including the use of the new technologies. A couple of words at the end of this slide about competition. Under some conditions, competitive outcomes are Pareto optimal, and any optimum can be achieved with lump sum wealth transfers. However, it is not true when it comes to competition that anything goes. especially when there are information and other obstacles, we need rules of the game for a fair playing field, which then has to be part of the regulatory design. Likewise, an exception to the theorem valued money, that is to say, money as a store of value, and monetary policy become tenuous in environments in which contracts and markets are almost complete, leaving small gaps. So this, again, this tension is present, but rarely faced, and we'll come back to that as we go through. So that's my take on what we should be trying to do, optimize design. We often, though, encounter ad hoc criteria, and I ask that we be leery of using these buzzwords as sort of desirable things to have happen, although going through the list quickly, there are important lessons for design. So you've probably heard and used the terminology fast payments, real-time gross settlement, and atomic swaps. Sounds like good stuff. Let's do it. Well, let's be careful. First of all, with fast payments, imbalances are inevitable. Flows do not match. The BIS, much aware of this, has written papers arguing that fast payments at the retail level are likely to create imbalances which will load on to large wholesale entities in the wholesale markets. The solution, of course, is try to design a system not to eliminate the shortages per se, but to deal with the shortages. Related issue then is, should the central bank be the one absorbing all the third-party risk? That is an open question. It should be considered in the policy designs. Is there some guidance? Yes. If we go to pre-existing literature, money with micro foundations, once one understands the transactions patterns, then it becomes clear what the optimal central bank policy ought to be. Real-time gross settlement, surely we have it. No, hardly ever, we don't. The problem with real-time settlement is it's necessary to fund accounts with liquidity balances to be used for clearing, and that's pretty expensive because resources should be used for something else, and private sector entities want to make money. So in fact, the necessary liquidity for clearing is not fully funded. This leads to a problem of who pays whom when in order to conserve liquidity. Clearing is a computationally complex process, and gridlocks are actually not at all uncommon, even in the world's leading clearing systems. The solution potentially is to use markets under which agents have heterogeneous valuations and allocate liquidity in a more decentralized fashion. This is something Rod Garrett has proposed, and that we're trying to follow up with my collaborators, Nicholas Zhang and Rod, proposing something to the BIS. Atomic swaps, where liquidity is exchanged for a digital asset instantaneously. It avoids fails because nothing happens till both parties agree, and the transfer is instantaneous. However, fails may actually be optimal if markets are incomplete. And this goes back to some work of Dubé and Giannakopoulos and some articles in Finance, which I haven't cited on the slide. So the problem here is designing an all-purpose system. It becomes hazardous. Tokens in particular imperil the benefit of legacy systems, which allows more privacy. if you have to reveal you own an asset in order to trade it, you're revealing something about your trading position. And this is work I've been engaged with my collaborators at the New York Fed, Michael Lee and Antoine Martin, where we show again what optimal configurations are, one or the other, depending on the underlying environment. So let me come to the cryptography part, payments and privacy. I'm going to go through two endpoints and talk about something in between. So one endpoint is basically, let's try to conceal everything and just stop there. This is not a new idea. Chom actually developed an early proposal for eCash in 1982, preceding Bitcoin, and it uses cryptography in analogy to carbon copy paper stashed away in sealed envelopes. More formally and recently, we have contemporary multi-party computation. So for the Riksbank, Chom and Grothoff and Moser have proposed in a revised 2021 version an encryption algorithm for e-corona in which essentially everything is kept private. And the basic idea is to encrypt the individual payments and perform operations on the payments in the encrypted space. Likewise, Neha has a paper with co-authors on ZK Ledger. This uses something called Pedersen commitments, which is additively homomorphic. The idea is that one can keep track of the sum of individual financial transactions to get the balance sheet that's needed by regulators who have to audit and monitor what's going on in the financial system, but the aggregation does not reveal the individual transactions. So this is one endpoint. Another endpoint is represented by Alipay, digital payments on a proprietary database. So, you know, Alipay started with escrow services. Money is not released until payment is received, the goods are received. It is now well known for its credit, and more recently with my bank, in a paper in 2020, Chen and co-authors actually had permission to look at the database, and they could see Ant Financial's comprehensive credit scoring and the data from micro, small, medium enterprises offline, and also a large, somewhat larger, but millions of merchants online in Alibaba's e-commerce platform. So they use these daily payments data and an internal credit threshold, or in the jargon of our times, regression discontinuity, to show that credit access significantly reduces sales volatility. It's helping these small and medium firms. The effect is stronger for firms with fewer alternative sources of financing. And they show that firms with access to credit based on scores from the payment platform are less likely to go bankrupt or to exit the business. But Alibaba has gone further. It's created a wealth management, Alipay management platform featuring access for low-income participants and mutual funds, offering advisory services and life cycle planning. It also invites intermediaries, financial institutions to join the platform, not just households and businesses, and is engaged in a joint venture with Fidelity, and at least in the Wall Street Journal, as of yesterday, Vanguard is also about to join. The last thing is an online mutual aid platform, which is an insurance association, which is remarkably serving over 100 million households offering health expense protection. So this is financial infrastructure originally based on payments, but extending into all these areas. Now, when we start talking about proprietary, databases, then what emerges is this concern about big techs, namely who owns and uses the data. I feel it is necessary to give you my take on this by offering two examples of conceptual designs that deal with privacy issues. Namely, one, the design of an optimized credit registry. The question is what information to share. One can use an algorithm, a code, to bundle loans together to avoid an unraveling problem we associate with Akerlof's lemons due to adverse selection. Of course, we need commitment, and we need the smart contract algorithm. This is something I'm working on with Nicole and Morlika and Andre Stutzman at MIT. A second example, exchange platforms, information gathered by the ability to monitor and execute agreements in OTC, create the problem of who has access to that information and what you can do with it. It turns out that the private sector, if it were to choose to sell some of that information, would do the worst possible thing and exacerbate the adverse selection problem for its own gain. Whereas a better scheme is to reveal nothing or everything. Again, something which in principle can be automated with smart contracts and the tools that we have. And this again is joint work with Garrett, Rod, and Lee and Martin at the New York Fed. So what's the middle ground between those two extremes? Optimized design with cryptography. And doing it in a way that avoids that big tech problem, which I've already alluded to. Payments and other data can be organized into quasi-financial accounts to create better information infrastructure. So again, as in thinking about Alipay, you have income from sales and purchases, either online or via the QR codes. You have items for the balance sheet, namely credit on one platform and assets on the other via wealth management, and of course the cash flow from the payments data themselves. So you have somewhat, I would not say complete, but you have a great start on building financial accounts, making organized use of the payment data. Now I want to take you through some joint work with Nicholas Zhang, who's in computer science and artificial intelligence here at MIT, about sharing data, sharing the line items of financial accounts used via multi-party computation, about writing smart contracts with insurance inferred, even if everyone's got private information and doesn't know the full picture. And finally, hybrid combination of smart contracts and ledgers. So first, the use of privacy preserving data aggregation. This picture hopefully conveys the image that there's private data as line items on the accounts, X1, which Andrew has, X2, which Susan has, and so on. As kind of a metaphor, they throw in very large randomly chosen numbers to conceal the Ys, and then the Ys are then added up. So at the end of the first round, so to speak, we've got the sum of the actual underlying data and the sum of a lot of random noise. Then the participants can go in turn taking out their individual transactions, their noise, and everyone is left at the end with the sum. This is something that will be very costly to do on distributed ledgers with validation protocols, as you can see by counting up all the messages. Second use case is privacy preserving smart contracts using fully homomorphic encryption and multi-party computation. And the idea in this picture is there's some loss that individual participants experience. They're supposed to get some transfer as an indemnity X, and it turns out that if they're all experiencing losses as in an aggregate state, there's an additional transfer indemnity B that's supposed to kick in. So just think about, is there an aggregate shock or not? If there is an aggregate shock, A is equal to 1, and the B indemnity kicks in. If the aggregate shock is not there, then it's just X. So you see this sort of binary classification, if-then algorithms. This is what computers and code are very good at. So the ultimate transfer is a weighted sum, with A being either 0 or 1 of the X plus B or the X. Now, the point about the encryption is that A is not known. No one knows it, but in using MPC, one can add up the individual transactions and infer what A is. So A is something encoded that no one sees, and yet amazingly, the code is able to operate as it should to implement the transfer B in the case that there's an aggregate state. I always think of this as being either very obvious because of properties of homomorphic spaces, or very amazing as in pulling rabbits out of hats. But this trick, these kinds of tricks are very powerful. So here's a more general design, which is the combination of using smart contracts and ledgers. These guys here, agents A and B, are sitting there with their accounts, their balance sheets and income statements and so on, as in the database I talked about. And they've entered into a contract, and they are induced, incentivized to send messages, and under mechanism design, they would be truthful mechanisms, truthful messages going into the code. And then the code operates and delivers instructions for transfers, which under smart contracts can be automated on the ledgers, so that that comes back to the balance sheets of agents A and B. So a couple of points here. The messages are encrypted, so the parties aren't seeing anything. There's no planner, there's just code. So nobody's learning anything. The other thing about the mechanism design is it's not like, tell me your line item. You can actually, induce the reporting of the data because it comes part and parcel of the incentives under the contract. So I don't know what you want to call off-chain or on-chain, which part is which, but the point is you're sort of doing a lot of things off, with the smart contract part and doing other things with the ledgers part. And there's a lot of choice. If you want to use third-party, trusted third parties on ledgers, you don't have to go the route of having the validated decentralized ledgers. So we're building applications with these kinds of tools, auctions without auctioneers, hybrid borrowing and lending with insurance options. That kind of gets at the liquidity problems I've been mentioning, that you need thick markets and you need inducements for people to join those markets. This would help with the M-Pesa problem in Kenya. There is an informal arrangement, and not very well documented, among the agents of Safaricom. More generally, money transfer organizations trying to implement cross-border payments, as the fintechs Velo and Everynet in Thailand, for example, will have to deal with these kinds of liquidity shortages, basically insurance layered on top of credit. And SMEs suffer from liquidity shocks. They're vulnerable to supply chain shocks. central banks will need to deal and are, as I've said, trying to deal with this in thinking about the blueprints for cross-border movement of fiat monies for exchange rates and reserve with shocks and so on. This can be taken to the repo market in the US with my co-authors, Daniel Aronoff and Nicholas again, and also this is in conjunction with Neha at the Digital Currency Initiative at MIT to avoid coordination problem, leverage constraints, and deal with the information problem. Dig back in the literature. Green and Lin have a solution to the bank run problem. That can all be implemented with these combinations of technologies, as well as voluntary data sharing, linking up literature, monetary theory literature on multiple colored tokens to what you can do with these technologies. So,
Rob, is there a natural point at which you can open it up for Q&A? I'm a little worried that people will have lots of questions and we won't have enough time for that.
Yes, there's just 2 slides here.
Okay,
so, good. I wanted to come back to what should the US be doing. US infrastructure, there's various symptoms of the problems. I can go over this in more detail in the Q&A, but basically tracking COVID, trying to figure out what's happening. Ironically, we're using payments data. Central banks around the world are now trying to do nowcasting using payments data. And yet we're still stuck in this system where we think about monetary policy in the aggregate and create special targeting facilities at the micro level. So we need new conceptual frameworks. I think it's time to address that. Inequality is a big issue in the US, but ironically, it's not actually all that well measured because the accounts are not integrated, and I can go into that in more detail. And I have plans at the bottom here for how to address those issues. And finally, better financial infrastructure for the US, for SMEs, following these steps of better database, smart contracts with insurance options, with the necessary flexibility and encryption, securitization, as had been done in Europe, but now with digital assets in secondary markets and better trading facilities. So these are all steps that I think can and should be taken with the new technology. So let me stop there.
Terrific. That fantastic overview. So I'm going to take the privilege of starting, going back to China's digital currency electronic payment system. They have chosen not to use a blockchain approach. And there's different stories about that. One story is they can't get sufficient transactions per second. Another story I've heard is that the authorities want some flexibility in being able to reverse transactions, and that's more difficult with the blockchain. And yet another story is that they're going to integrate it with some blockchain-based tokenized payment systems that will join. Have you any insights into the suitability of a blockchain-based approach for a central bank digital currency like China's?
I would say that, starting with Bitcoin as the sort of premier example of a distributed ledger, it's really quite something, and it's made a big impression. There are alternatives, as Stellar and Ripple, use alternative algorithms. So, but the big point to me about the distributed ledgers is they're not necessarily incentive compatible. That is to say, as Morris and Shin have shown, those things work if everyone follows the algorithm, but we have to induce people to follow the algorithm if you believe in incentives and Nash equilibria and so on. So that just comes back to my plea for thinking about the component parts. the smart contracts and what you can do. I think we make mistakes in insisting that we have to choose the technology and then run everything on a given version of the technology. So they have, for example, seemingly decided not to go, with automated smart contracts, but they could build that in. That part is possible because even if the underlying transactions are encrypted, you can still write smart contracts, obviously, on the encrypted data. They've just chosen at the moment not to feature that for some reason, but they could certainly do that. So I just repeat, I think you have to be clear about what the overall goal is. What are they trying to accomplish with this? And if there are multiple goals, maybe they can use some parts of the system for one thing and other parts for a different thing.
There's a question from Farhad Mafi, who asks about updates on the Fed's central bank digital currency project. Do you have Neha's intimately involved with that because MIT Digital Labs is working with the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. But do you have views on why the Fed has not already developed this for deployment rather than is focusing mainly on research at this stage, and whether or not a central bank digital currency is actually suitable for the US?
Well, I think there are many good things that can be done with a digital currency. I didn't get to talk very much about plans, but if one is trying to help SMEs or poor households in Appalachia and so on with better financial tools and links to market, the whole financial access thing, then they are using paper currency, it's true, but if they were, it helps to have a central bank liability as fiat money. So I think it would be easier to induce people to join the system. In China, of course, it's Alipay offering all these services, so people don't want to give up any part of that, and then the data kind of come along as a crucial ingredient. I guess my other take on, I'm not sure I want to address why it's slow. The Federal Reserve, for better or for worse, tends to be quite conservative in the U.S. about taking these steps, and I think there is a risk that they want to assure the public that they're not going to get data. I think Neha can talk more about this. Maybe trying to build on all these systems to protect privacy instead of what I would recommend, and Neha has her own work on this, which is encrypting the data in such a way that it actually can be used to build a better infrastructure. So I'm a little worried the U.S. is gone too far toward the total privacy aspect of this spectrum.
Well, speaking of that, there's a question from Alex Gladstein, and I'm just going to repeat it verbatim. Why would an authoritarian regime build a CBDC that has true cash-like privacy for citizen transactions? Can you think of any precedents for this?
Well, it kind of loaded with the preamble at the beginning. Yeah, the worry, of course, is that they really want the data, and for what purpose, that worries people. But if the questioner is simply asking, have other countries implemented either with pilots or maybe even further along central bank digital currencies, the answer is yes. So for example, the Bahamas has one to build better infrastructure to be able to channel relief for hurricanes and so on. There's digital pesos, and South Africa is quite far along. The goal in South Africa is financial access. Not everybody, as in Kenya, relatively few people have commercial bank accounts. So following the China route of basically continuing to use commercial banks is not going to solve the financial access problem. So South Africa, much aware of that, is trying to have a more universal access to the coin.
This might be our last question because we only have a minute or so before we're going to make a transition to the end of this webinar. This question is from Yanling Fu, who asks, is it safe to say that China's government wants to compete with Alipay and other available electronic payment services that are currently in the market?
I don't know what the Chinese government is thinking about. They've been going after Alipay for other reasons. The regulators seem to think that there's a lot of risk in those loans, which are being loaded onto commercial banks, as Alipay doesn't have access to deposits, so basically it can't fund all the loans it can generate. So it's issuing these consortium type loans to the commercial banks. I personally think this is a mistake. I think the regulators are using a traditional sort of legacy view of innovation. Fintechs and innovations are blocked all over the world because the regulators don't have appropriate frameworks to thinking about things. But there's definitely attention being picked up in the questioner's question about what is why do you need CBDC if you're going to have Alipay and vice versa.
It was reported 2 days ago that China's government is putting pressure on Ant Group to reveal more of the transactions data to the government. We are at the end of our available time for this webinar. It seems to have gone so quickly. I want to thank you, Rob, for sharing all of this. And this is the end. Well, this is the end of this webinar. I would invite the members of the working group who are available to stay till the top of the hour to have a conversation with you. Thank you.
Thank you.